Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this History Indoors talk. It's great to have you all with us. Do let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, uh, and like, it'd be great to know where people are tuning in from. Just because it's fun for us to know. We often have people tuning in from across the world sometimes, or local areas, so we always double check. So do let us know. If you don't know much about History Indoors, we do provide history talks every 2 weeks on a variety of different topics, ranging from ancient history, archaeological history, all the way through to the modern day. And we cover things economic, social histories, military histories, you name it, we've provided for it. And if you have missed any of our talks, do go check the channel out. Do check out the last few talks. They're fantastic. I really recommend them. Do subscribe to the channel. Do like this video as well, because the more people like it, the more it's seen and the more people will watch it later. And if you are watching it back as well, as many people do watch these videos back in later periods, do like it as well and leave a comment as well to where you're watching it from, because we like to really engage with our audience. If you have any, please do check us out on like you said, the YouTube channel, and make sure that you follow us in any stream possible. But that's enough about History Indoors. You can if I miss anything out, I'm sure you can just check the YouTube channel out for more information. But I'm privileged to welcome a guest speaker this evening here in England, which is Dr. Adam Prime, who's independent historian of the 19th century and military history, especially of the Indian Army. Absolutely, thank you so much for wanting to speak for us this evening. So thank you, Adam, for that. There will be a Q&A at the end of this. So if you have any questions, please do ask them at the end, and I'll come back and I'll be able to ask those questions on your behalf, and we can have a really good discussion. But until then, I'll leave you in Adam's very capable hands, and I hope you really enjoy.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everybody. Let's begin then. So, in 1915, Major John Alves published The Indian Army ABC, being a record of some of those depressing events that occur in the daily life of every officer of the Indian Army, under the pseudonym Mayok. Alves was an officer in the 93rd Burma Infantry, having been commissioned into the British Army in 1900 and transferred to the Indian Army in 1907. Alves was the son of Colonel John Morrison Alves, Royal Artillery, and the grandson of Colonel Nathaniel Alves of the Madras Army. So, alongside 15 years' service of his own, the Alves family had a lengthy connection both with the military and India. The ABC was a series of cartoons, each of which, as the name suggests, corresponds to a letter of the alphabet. Some of these related to native troops of the Indian Army, others to pastimes on the subcontinent, such as sports and hunting. Some related directly to the officer corps. For example, E discusses the fact Indian Army officers had to take a variety of examinations in order to both enter and gain promotion in the Indian Army, but more on that later. There's also a cartoon which shows a rather leisurely officer having a smoke on a hillside as Sikh troops attempt to sneak up on what appears to be a tribal lashkar or war party on the opposite side of the slope. The tribal stick figures and the terrain of the cartoon would suggest that this is the northwest frontier of India, modern-day Pakistan, where, depending on how you saw it, there existed either an uneasy truce or a constant state of war with the Muslim tribes who inhabited the area, and where most officers of the Indian Army wished to serve and see action. The eye in the cartoon is the idiot officer, surrendering the element of surprise with puffs of smoke from his cigar. I'm sure there's several people watching thinking, why is he talking about a cartoon from 1915? This talks allegedly about the period immediately after the Great Rebellion of 1857. Well, we'll return to these at the end, so stick around and hopefully it makes sense. But if we move on to the main part of the talk, what I'd like to do is first take a brief look at the origins and course of the 1857 rebellion. I think this will really help to set the scene. Following the end of the conflict, two commissions were set up, one in Britain and one in India, to try and learn from the insurrection, especially the military mutiny element. And we'll take a look at both of these. We'll then look at what was changed for the Indian soldier, the sepoy, in light of the rebellion, and look at the alterations made to render service in the Indian Army more agreeable. From there, we'll move on to the officer corps of the Indian Army, who were in this period all British or European, and ask what was changed there to provide the Indian Army a more committed and professional officer corps, which of course would also make service in the Indian Army more agreeable for the private soldier, before reaching a conclusion about the changes that were made after the conclusion of the 1857 rebellion. So, let's set the scene and provide some much needed context. British India was garrisoned, controlled and defended by two separate elements. The first was the British Army. The second was a force purposely raised for the subcontinent. Granted royal charter in 1600, the East India Company, henceforth the EIC, had initially recruited men in Britain to join their own army and be permanently stationed in India. These European battalions guarded factories, outposts, and trading stations. Such early coastal possessions grew into the presidencies of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. In 1773, the Governor-General of Bengal became the Governor-General of India. Likewise, the Commander-in-Chief of the Bengal Army had overall command of the military on the subcontinent. The three armies were not actually formally amalgamated until 1895. The EIC's main rival in India was France. It was they who were first to experiment with the use of locally recruited troops. These sepoys, a derivative of the Persian word sipahi, meaning infantryman, quickly mastered European drill. Both the French and the British realized that these troops were cheaper, already acclimatized, and much more numerous than European soldiers. From 1756, EIC sepoys began to be organized into battalions and companies consisting of around 1,000 men. Battalions were organized in a similar manner to those of the British Army. A lieutenant colonel commanded the battalion, supported by two majors, who commanded a wing or half battalion each. The battalion was then divided into 10 companies, each commanded by a captain or lieutenant, all of which, I should point out, would have been European at this stage, or British. The EIC overcame their French competitors during the 7 Years' War. Finding themselves free of European competition in India, the EIC's armies grew and further victories followed. Their territory swelled. After victory in the Anglo-Sikh War, Lahore was annexed, as were several smaller states who were unable to resist the EIC militarily. The British then annexed Awadh in February 1856, an area of northern India which now constitutes the northeastern portion of Uttar Pradesh, under the pretense that the kingdom was corrupt. This proved to be a crucial step on the road to rebellion, as Awadh was a sizable recruiting ground for the Bengal army. In the years preceding 1857, there had also been a tightening of discipline within the EIC's army, and unpopular changes were made to the sepoys' uniform. In place of baggy native dress, sepoys wore tight red coats and close-fitting trousers, as well as heavy brass-rimmed shakos and leather stocks around their necks. The Bengal army had also borne the brunt of EIC expansion in the 19th century, undertaking the bulk of the fighting in Afghanistan, the Punjab, and China. The officer-man relationship was significantly damaged prior to the Great Rebellion as well. Officers had become bored and in some cases lazy, They looked to leave regiments at the first opportunity in favour of civilian employment, which could be A, more interesting, and B, more lucrative. In the 18th century, officers had taken Indian wives, which naturally helped them pick up the vernacular languages and assimilate with Indian culture. By 1857, though, an influx of European women meant such practices had died out. There were several cases in the 1840s and 50s of sepoys being court-martialed for insolence simply because they'd grown aggravated trying to make themselves understood. The 1856 General Service Enlistment Act demanded that sepoys agree to serve abroad if required. This was intended to make the army more flexible and was only applicable to new recruits. Yet it was feared that all sepoys would be sent abroad. This unpopular change was further exacerbated by the fact that prior to its annexation, Avad had been treated as abroad. Sepoys serving there would have been eligible for extra pay. The most often cited cause of the 1857 rebellion, though, is the issue of ammunition greased with either cow or pig fat, offensive to Hindus and Muslims respectively. The ammunition for the newly distributed Enfield rifle came in the form of a paper cartridge, which was opened and loaded by biting. Both Muslims and Hindus sepoys were greatly concerned by this, even if the cartridge being used were not greased with the offensive material. The rumour was powerful. Troops sent to depots to train with the new weapons risked being stigmatised. Solutions were numerous. Alternative lubricants such as beeswax and coconut oil were issued. In Madras, the cartridge was simply distributed ungreased and the sepoys supplied their own lubricant. In Bengal, however, rumours not only persisted but also grew. It began to be said that the paper for the cartridge was also made from forbidden animals, and that the bones of both cows and pigs were being ground down by the British and added to flour. Acts of defiance ensured at Berhampur and Meerut amongst troops who opposed the issuing of the new cartridges. It was Meerut where the military mutiny truly began, though. Dissenters were arrested and imprisoned, only for their comrades to spring them from jail and begin to attack Europeans. Swelled by civilians, mutineers from other regiments as well, these rebels left Meerut and headed towards Delhi. The scenes in Meerut were echoed elsewhere. In Avad, EIC rule quickly disintegrated. As garrisons of sepoys mutinied, their ranks were enlarged by civilians, turning a military mutiny into a rebellion. Heavily populated cities such as Kanpur, Delhi, and Lucknow became centres for the rebellion. At Lucknow, loyal Indian and British troops defeated the mutineers, who once defeated marched to Delhi. Later in the rebellion, the residency building at Lucknow, which you can see on screen, was besieged and subsequently relieved. At Delhi, the mutineers took the city, but the Delhi Field Force, the DFF, was able to take control of the ridge outside of the city. The DFF held the ridge against numerous rebel attacks and slowly increased its numbers in order to retake the city. The DFF massed their artillery to fire on the mutineers before assaulting the city. The siege lasted between the 8th of June and the 20th of September, 1857. At Kanpur, soldiers and civilians were granted free passage to waiting riverboats, but were attacked before they could reach them. When Kanpur was retaken, British retaliatory action was severe. In fact, British reprisals were severe throughout Bengal, perhaps the most famous example being the firing of mutineers from cannon. The rebellion never spread, though, beyond Bengal and was stamped out by July 1858. It was the greatest challenge to British authority that the empire had faced since the American Revolutionary War and signalled the end of the EIC. The British Crown replaced the EIC and began to implement changes to the Indian Army. Indian sepoy loyalty was obviously questioned, But it would be impossible to rule India without a native force. It was impractical and financially unviable to garrison India with only British troops. In July 1858, a special parliamentary committee, the Peel Commission, was formed, headed by Major General Jonathan Peel, Secretary of State for War, and younger brother of Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. The aim of the commission was to review the state of the Indian Army and help to determine the size of the force moving forward. The commission consulted 47 witnesses, all of whom had two things in common. They had military experience of India, and they were white. No Indians were consulted as part of the commission, thus the sepoys themselves had no agency in the process. Peel presented his recommendations of the commission to Parliament in March 1859. The commission offered few firm recommendations, however. The 7-page report offered a series of vague suggestions as how the Indian Army could move forward from the Great Rebellion. The report was supported with over 600 pages of addenda, largely the answer provided by the 47 correspondents. Much of this evidence was contradictory. For example, with regards to language, Major General Robert Alexander, former Adjutant General of the Madras Army, wrote that he felt it better that officers learn the native languages of their sepoys. On the other hand, British Army officer Colonel Orlando Felix, which is a fantastic name, he argued that native officers should be encouraged to learn English. Whilst Major General Sir Frederick Abbott suggested that officers had only learned native languages in order to gain the civilian secondments that were more lucrative, and without the enticement, few would attempt to learn the languages of their sepoys. One of the few solid recommendations made by the Peel Commission was in relation to the numbers of troops that were required to control India, and the ratio of European to Indian troops necessary in each presidency. Born of mistrust of both high caste Hindu soldiers and Muslim troops, it was recommended that the British garrison in India be increased to around 80,000 men. In the presidencies of Bombay and Madras, where rebellion did not spread, there was to be a ratio of 3 Indian troops to 1 British soldier. In Bengal, the epicenter of the rebellion, the ratio was to be 2 sepoys to 1 British soldier. There was a second group set up to consider much the same issues, the Punjab Committee. The Punjab Committee had its origins in India rather than Britain, and its head was Sir John Lawrence. The findings of Lawrence's commission were included in the appendix of Peel's. The Punjab Committee came into conflict with the Peel Commission over the issue of mixing racial groups within a regiment. It was the consensus of those asked as part of the Peel Commission that regiments should contain different nationalities and races. As such, that was recommended by the Peel Commission report. The Punjab Committee, on the other hand, felt that a divide and rule approach would continue to be more appropriate. Keeping national groups apart would help reduce the sharing of grievances. In much the same way, Lawrence and his committee felt that 3 presidency armies were essential were essential to Indian security too. Keeping them separate would again reduce the chance of disaffection spreading. Based on recommendations of the Peel Committee, some general mixture regiments were created in the Bengal Army in the 1860s. But it was, overall, Lawrence's view in particular that was given credence. I think in deference to Lawrence himself, as the man who had secured the Punjab for the EIC, recruited heavily there, and then played a significant role in the recapture of Delhi during the rebellion. For the sepoys, there were early and obvious changes, easy wins, if you will, around uniform. The Indian soldier's uniform was adapted to better assimilate to the climate and customs of the subcontinent. The tight red coats worn by the sepoys were replaced by looser fitting tunics. The leather stocks were abolished and heavy shakos were also replaced. It's worth pointing out that the leather stock had fallen out of use in the British Army by this point and had actually been abolished altogether in 1855. You can see, if I move between the two, the differences in the uniform, particularly around the neck and how tight the coat and trousers are. The Peel Commission considered an idea known as the irregular system. The irregular system had been created in the early 19th century by Europeans such as James Skinner, who had been in the employ of the Mughal armies before joining the EIC. Its purpose was to placate the EIC's Muslim troops and to attract further recruits by keeping the military organisation akin to that of the Mughal forces, which predated the EIC. Irregular units had fewer European officers, and so gave greater responsibility to the Indian officer. These irregular regiments of between 500 and 600 sepoys had just 6 European officers, although some pre-1857 irregular units had as few as 3 officers. Interestingly, Skinner was the son of a Scottish EIC officer and a Rajput mother, a product of the interracial relationships that began to die out as the 19th century progressed, which I touched on earlier. The idea behind this was that one European officer with the correct approach could inspire the loyalty of 1,000 native troops, whereas 30 European officers would make the Indian officer or Viceroy Commissioned Officer, VCO, as they would become known, obsolete, giving the private soldier neither the incentive to further himself nor anything in common with his superiors. This concept was known as cultivated loyalty. Just to try and give some context here, I have provided a table of the ranks on screen. An Indian officer could not rise above the rank of Risaldar Major in the cavalry and Subadar Major in the infantry. These roles, as well as the subordinate ranks of Risaldar, Subadar, and Jemadar, were effectively a conduit between the private Indian soldier and the European officer, occupying a space between the non-commissioned officers and their officers, to which there was no equivalent in the British Army. The rank of second lieutenant upwards was exclusively European during the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Only in 1917, as recognition for India's contribution towards the First World War, and as an attempt to appease rising nationalism, were a small number of commissions awarded to Indians. The irregular system had worked for men such as Sir John Jacob. Jacob had joined the EIC in 1828 and saw action in the First Anglo-Afghan War and on the northwest frontier. In 1841, he was given command of the Sind Irregular Horse, which became better known as Jacob's Horse. Jacob implemented the irregular system to good effect. His men were so devoted that when the rebellion began, they remained loyal despite Jacob not being in India at the time. Jacob's 2 battalions were made up predominantly of Muslims from Delhi and the United Provinces. They were the same class as most of the regular sepoys who had joined the rebellion. Only 10 of the Bengal Army's 18 irregular cavalry regiments joined the rebellion, whereas almost all of the regular regiments of the Bengal Army mutinied. Jacob was a great advocate of this system, and although he died in 1858, his ideas and opinions were heeded by the post-rebellion commissions. After the rebellion, it was decided that the standing of the native officer, or the VCO, should be heightened. The irregular system offered the opportunity to do this. In those units converted to the irregular system, after the rebellion, Indian officers thrived and proved to be more than capable. From 1863 onwards, a battalion would have 7 British officers. This was not as drastic perhaps as some irregular units of the EIC, but it still provided Indian officers with ample opportunities such as leading troops and commanding outposts miles away from their European superiors. The job of the British officer was largely as a supervisor. Native officers commanded companies in the infantry or troops in the cavalry. As the historian of the Royal Deccan Horse put it, the paucity of British officers has this advantage, that it throws more work, responsibility, and independence upon the Indian officers, thus increasing their efficiency, which is liable to deteriorate when everything is done by the British officers. What's more, promotion of Indian officers was altered. NCOs and VCOs were now to be selected for their energy and efficiency. In contrast, promotion of sepoys under the EIC was based largely on length of service. This resulted in a large number of VCOs and NCOs being upwards of 60. This had been one of the recommendations made by the Peel Commission. Most of the witnesses who gave advice to the Commission agreed that promotion by length of service was a significant problem for the army of the EIC. Colonel John Welchman of the 1st Bengal European Fusiliers wrote, "Promotion by seniority is the bane of the army." Whilst Major General Lowe, a veteran of some 50 years' service, wrote, "Merit and fitness should be more consulted in the promotion of native commissioned and non-commissioned officers." This had the effect of giving the sepoys something to aim for, to aspire to, not something they simply gained by dint of long service. Financially, the irregular system was attractive to the government and military authorities in India too. Fewer British officers meant lower costs. The system, though, was never fully taken up in the 1860s in the Bengal Army. Only a small number of regiments were remodeled in Bombay, and the planned rollout of this system to Madras never went through at all, and it was met with considerable ill will. So why was the irregular system not rolled out across India? Well, the answer can be located, in part, in the pages of the Times of India, where much hostility can be found. In an anonymous letter to the editor in 1865, someone claiming to be a regular cavalryman of the Madras army laid down his objections to the change of system. Firstly, the writer argued that a number of older officers, formerly of the EIC, who were good line officers but were ill-suited to the irregular system. He stated men of about 30 years' service, who, although good steady officers for regular regiments, are not the style of man to infuse that spirit and dash which is considered essential qualities in an irregular one. Thus it was reasoned men with the required gallantry and knowledge would have to be selected to command the new irregular battalions. This would put younger men of lower rank above majors and lieutenant colonels with 20 or 30 years' service, as was the traditional way with the irregular cavalry units of the EIC. Men were to be specially selected based on ability, not seniority. This aggrieved a good many officers, and in 1865 the matter was brought to Parliament in the form of a petition. Signed by 750 officers of all ranks in the Indian service, Secretary of State for India Sir Charles Wood had to defend the Indian Army's proposed new selection process, citing precedents from the army list of the EIC. The same letter to the editor also argued that the sepoys of Madras would be ill-suited to the change in system. The writer claimed that the Madras sepoys required constant and strict European supervision, and without it they would be about as useless as an animal as there is on the face of the earth. By comparison, the author noted, northern tribesmen, such as those recruited into the Bengal army, were accustomed to the handling of arms from youth and grew up to be soldiers. He claimed that the Madras cavalry regiment needed a full complement of officers in order to guarantee that they paraded well. An irregular cavalry unit from Madras would make a far less impressive sight on parade, according to the writer. It is worth pointing out that this bias against Madras sepoys' ability was widely held and fostered in the following decades, bolstering what was known as the martial race theory. Martial race theory being the concept that peoples of northern India, namely Punjabi Sikhs, Muslim tribesmen of the northwest frontier, and Nepalese Gurkhas had the best fighting pedigree and would be disproportionately recruited into the Indian army. The letter in question and others like it, as well as the petition to Parliament, highlight the objections within the Indian army to the blanket adoption of the irregular system. Traditionally, historians have attributed the stalling of the irregular system to the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which saw the British Indian Army suffer reverses such as the Battle of Maiwand, and highlighted the fragility of the irregular system. It was felt that several of these reversals was due to a lack of officers in Indian battalions. A battalion only needed to lose 3 of its officers, and its officer corps was halved. After the conflict, it was also decided to increase the number of sepoys in a battalion, as, under the stress of service, as it was put, they suffered heavy losses. As such, in 1882, the number of sepoys per battalion was raised from 712 to 832, bringing it closer in line to the number of men in a British Army battalion. In the same year, the number of British officers in an Indian unit was increased from 7 to 10. The Second Anglo-Afghan War may have been the stress test that finished the irregular system, but there were other more practical issues as well. The irregular system was financially attractive to the authorities of the British Raj, but to be financially viable, the system required total devotion of its officers. Men like Skinner and Jacobs spent all of their time with the regiment without taking lengthy furlough or leave of any kind. In the post-mutiny irregular units, the officers were not so willing to go without annual leave to which they were entitled. In order to cater for this, many regiments had to have 2 lieutenant colonels, one to cover, whilst the other was on leave, and also double up further down the chain of command too. This was quite costly. For instance, the 14th Bengal Native Infantry should have been spending 4,395 rupees per month on officers' wages, but the wages were actually 6,071 rupees, even with those on furlough and leave being on half pay. Furthermore, promotion in the army of the Raj was based on length of service, but with less positions available in the irregular system, officers were left to stagnate in roles supposed to be filled by more junior ranks. Again, the 14th Bengal Native Infantry is a useful example. If we consider just the highest rank in the battalion, the colonel, to cover for furlough and because men had been promoted after length of service without them having a more senior position to fill, there was 1 full colonel and 4 lieutenant colonels, 2 or 3 of which were on leave at any one time, 1 in command and 1 as second in command. This is quite clearly where the issue with annual wages sits, if you're paying potentially 5 colonels. I think the practical issues of pay, furlough cover and promotion, alongside the resistance from within the office corps itself, did for the irregular system. The Second Anglo-Afghan War was perhaps the final nail in the coffin for that particular concept. What this suggests then is that within a decade of the Great Rebellion, one of the major attempts to foster greater job satisfaction for sepoys, to use a modern term, was abandoned as the number of British officers in the Indian units began to rise again. In fact, by the time of the Great War, the average number of British officers in an Indian battalion was between 12 and 14. There were some alterations to the pay and allowances, but nothing major for sepoys. There was, as I've said, changes to the uniform, and promotion of NCOs and VCOs was now based on performance, not solely length of service, providing reward for efficiency. However, I believe the biggest change, the greatest way in which service in the Indian Army was made more attractive, was by providing a better class of officer, regardless of their number. So let's stay with promotion and look at how promotion of British officers was changed. Under the EIC, age had been a similar problem for European officers. As Philip Mason put it, they had been encouraged they had encouraged officers to stay on in command of troops until they were gout-ridden invalids of 70. As you can probably tell from that quote, Mason, who himself was an Indian civil servant, wrote quite a lively account of the Indian Army Officer Corps in the 1970s, although some of it we would probably find problematic. Well, we do find problematic today. But that snappy quote illustrates quite well the problem. Officers in the EIC belonged to the regiment, and their promotion was based upon seniority within that regiment, which resulted in a slow rate of promotion. It was a case of waiting for the officer in front of you to retire or die, and then take his place. War or disease were your friend on your quest for promotion, provided you yourself survived. The EIC's Board of Control estimated that on average it took an officer 48 years to progress from commission to colonelcy. In 1861, the Indian Staff Corps was created. An officer was now commissioned to the unattached list of the Staff Corps, and all regimental, staff and civilian positions were filled from this central pool. The armies of Bengal, Bombay and Madras each had their own Staff Corps, but officers could move between the three. These were pools of manpower from which to draw officers. This provided officers with more scope for transfer between regiments, and meant that promotion was not hampered by seniority within just one regiment. When the officers of the EIC were transferred to the Crown in 1858, there was some disquiet as serving the Queen came with less pay and allowances than a service with the EIC. However, this was still more than service with the British Army. It's outside the scope of this talk, but the officers and men of the EIC's European battalions rejected their transfer to the British Army, particularly on grounds of pay and allowances, in what became known as the White Mutiny. But sticking with the officers of Indian regiments, who remained part of the Indian Army, the counter to their drop in pay was that the rate of promotion had increased significantly, so they could reach the higher ranks and subsequent higher pay much more quickly. In 1861, the length of service required for promotion was set at 16 years for a lieutenant to be promoted captain. 26 years service, a captain could be promoted to major, and a major could be promoted to lieutenant colonel after 35 years service. This was reduced further in 1865 to 12 years service for promotion to captain, 20 years for promotion to major, and 26 years service for promotion to lieutenant colonel. Obviously, this is a far cry from the average 48 years an EIC officer had to wait to reach a colonelcy. Coupled with the changes to promotion were the changes to training. Under the EIC, officers' training and education had been poor, if non-existent. A military seminary was established in 1809 at Addiscombe near Croydon to address this. Yet, even at Addiscombe, the curriculum was severely lacking. The syllabus revolved around largely mathematics. Other topics such as military fortification, chemistry, and technical drawing were all outdated, irrelevant, or too narrow for use in India. Even for the artillery and engineers officers, it was initially designed for. The teaching of Hindustani was equally poor, despite the company directors enlisting some top academics of their day to lecture there. According to one historian, T.A. Heathcote, the cadets shone only in drinking, swearing, and duelling. Anyone who did shine academically did so in spite of their EIC training, not because of it. Attempts were made to improve the language proficiency of officers in the Indian Regiment. From 1837, it was decreed that officers who joined from that year could not be appointed adjutant or interpreter unless they were in possession of a basic qualification in written and conversational Hindustani. From 1844, further attempts were made to improve the language competence of the officer corps. The Indian government introduced an order whereby no subaltern could take the role of troop or company commander unless they passed an examination in Hindustani. Yet problems persisted. Young officers soon learned that patronage could get them further than the possession of the second or third languages. Sir Charles Napier, Commander-in-Chief of India between 1849 and 51, recalled dealing with a number of court-martial cases whereby the problems arose not through a native soldier's insolence, but simply because they could not make their officer sufficiently understand them. Addiscombe was closed in 1861. Cadets now attended the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, just as potential British Army officers would, therefore receiving the same level of training. Upon graduating, they would elect to join the Indian Army. As the century progressed, this option became more popular. By the turn of the century, a cadet had to, with an eye for the subcontinent, had to pass out in the top 30 of his cohort in order to guarantee one of the limited places in the Indian Army. The exact number of places each year varied depending on the Indian Army's demand at the time. Upon their arrival in India, an officer would spend their first year of service not in an Indian unit, but with a British regiment serving in India, which had initially been a recommendation of the Peel Commission. Some officers called this their apprenticeship. The idea here was that an officer could acclimatise to India, begin to learn the vernacular, and also, I think, to make basic mistakes any junior officer would make, under the watchful eye of a British NCO who could correct them, as to make such mistakes in an Indian battalion may damage the prestige of the officer in the eyes of the Indian soldiers. After this year with a British unit, the officer would then move on to a posting with their Indian regiment. Within 3 years of service, an officer was required to pass an examination known as Higher Standard Hindustani. For the Higher Standard Hindustani, the officer had to pass a written translation from English, a viva voce translation from a textbook into English, reading and a viva voce translation from a manuscript, and a conversation. Additionally, an officer might be required to pass further examinations if a different language was chiefly spoken by the men of their regiment. For example, a Gurkha officer would be required to learn Gurkhali. Alongside the language examinations and length of service, between 1861 and 65, an officer had to be passed fit for command before he could be promoted. This process relied on the word of commanding officers. An officer simply needed his superior's nod of approval for promotion. This led to problems, most notably in 1865, when men of the 9th Bengal Cavalry revolted against their commandant, Captain Clifford Meacham. Meacham had been charging his men an additional tax, and using this pool of money to buy them new equipment. His aim was to ensure that his men always looked good on parade and catch the eye of his commanding officer, and gain his approval for promotion. Sir John Lawrence, Viceroy of India from 1864 to 69, wrote of Meacham, "This man cared for nothing than the goodwill of his commanding officer, and so the ill will and discontent of his men passed unchecked." This was perhaps the most prominent case, given that Meacham's men staged a peaceful mutiny, essentially going on strike against being charged more deductions than they should have been. Some of you may notice we've already seen Meacham's name this evening, as it was Clifford Henry Meacham that drew such wonderful pictures from the Lucknow residency, and I would really recommend anyone with 5 minutes spare to just look these up because they are some wonderful drawings. But it was certainly not the only instance, Meacham's was not the only instance of an officer not paying due care and attention to their men. According to Sir John Lawrence, my own impression is that the native army generally, and the native cavalry in particular, is overdrilled, overdressed, and overbothered, and hence that in spite of the solid advantages that the service is, by no means so popular as it might be. This to me shows the need to make service in the Indian Army more palatable for sepoys is still very much on the agenda. As Lawrence continued, there are many things in our military system which the natives like, such as the good and certain pay, the pensions, the furlough which they enjoy. But after all, in their minds, everything depends on the commanding officer. The native officers do not look to rule or law, nor even to the government, but they do look to him. And if he has not the qualities to either to command their love nor their reverence, a corpse may look well on parade and be drilled to any extent, but it will never stand the strain of real difficulty. It's against this backdrop of the mutiny of the 9th Bengal Cavalry that the professional examination was introduced to replace the say-so of a commanding officer. The professional examination was similar to that carried out by the British Army, another means by which the officers of both services could be kept to a similar standard. And it featured the drilling of a regiment of cavalry or infantry. Regimental duties were examined, including pay, pensions, and accounting. Arms, equipment, and supply were tested, and Indian military law too. An officer was also required to hold a musketry certificate. Cavalry officers were further examined on veterinary treatment, shoeing, and the fitting of saddlery. Sir Hugh Rose, one of the heroes of 1857 and Commander-in-Chief India between 1861 and 65, had stated upon taking the role that patronage should go by merit only, and the introduction of examinations, I would argue, is the next logical step in that. To try then to bring this to a close, I think the late 1850s and certainly the first half of the 1860s was a time of dramatic change and a lot of trial and error in the Indian Army. Some ideas took hold, such as the Indian Staff Corps, whilst others were never fully rolled out, such as the irregular system. But we can certainly see that there was attempts to make service in the Indian Army more palatable to the Indian sepoy. Pay and allowances were increased, and uniforms reverted back to something much closer to traditional Indian garb, much more suitable to the climate of the subcontinent. The promotion of VCOs and NCOs being based on ability would have offered encouragement to sepoys to better themselves and advance up the ranks. The irregular system would have added greater job satisfaction to the Indian officer and presented them with even more reason to push on in a more stretching and rewarding role. However, resistance within the British or European officer corps, alongside the practical considerations, meant this never took hold. But there was certainly a concerted effort to generate a more professional and capable officer corps, both for the efficiency of the Indian Army and also to make service in the Indian Army more appealing to the sepoy. There were further attempts at reform, most notably by two of the Victorian era's most celebrated soldiers, Lord Roberts and Kitchener. But the key takeaway here is that the reorganisation of the Indian officer corps and the introduction of examinations, both professional and language, remained, refined only a little, but remained. So ultimately, the alterations made in the 1860s meant that this was essentially the Indian Army Officer Corps that went to war in 1914. For example, to return to the ABC that I started with, the examinations originated in the 1860s and were still clearly tormenting officers in 1915. But despite all this, and at risk perhaps of undermining everything I've just said, the idiot, it would appear, still got through. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Fantastic. And so such an interesting talk as well. So thank you, Adam, for that. And I'm very interested by a few things that you said. But I will just, before I do ask any of my questions, I will just open the floor in case anyone has any of their own questions themselves, just in case I don't want to like just steal the thunder, as they say. But just gonna do you know what? I'll ask the first
Go
question.
for it.
I have the power. I've got the thing. What's interesting as well, you said about especially in Sandhurst that by especially by later on in a period there's quite a high number of people wanted to go and serve in the Indian Army. Especially that number was, say, top 30 of the class. You had to fit there to take one of the few positions that were available. Just why had it become so appealing
Uh,
for people to go into the Indian Army?
well, there's a few reasons. Largely, I call it the three Fs, which was family, finance, and familiarity. So it may
Mm,
be that an officer was looking to join the Indian Army because it was a family tradition.
okay.
Um, it may be that their father was in the British Army, but they'd served in India, taken the family with them, and there was a familiarity with the subcontinent and the opportunities it offered. And the other sort of really big one is in terms of finance, the pay's higher, the allowances are higher. So it might be that someone without sort of the personal wealth to afford a British regiment, whereby you have to pay for pretty much everything, your
Mm.
uniform, your horse, mess bills, etc. The Indian Army offers a much sort of cheaper or better paid alternative.
Okay,
Um,
so you've got those three kind of kind of key themes, which make a lot of sense, and also doesn't it, that the longevity of I guess of the army in India by this point in time, where people have that familiarity and also that family connections as well, with regiments and with the continent at that time as well, which had obviously been brewing for quite some time by this point in the late 19th century as well. I can imagine.
yeah, some sort of history suggests that there are, rather than sort of nobility and peerages as you'd find in the British Army, officers being able to talk about being third, fourth generation Indian Army came with that similar sort of level as prestige. And what you also get, sort of asking about the interest in India and why people go there,
Mm,
is you get a lot of officers who go to India with the British Army, find India is quite cheap, quite enjoyable. There's lots of hunting to be had. There's sports. There's a lot of cricket to be played, polo, etc. And then they transfer into the Indian Army. So effectively, an officer going to India with the British Army acts as a recruiting ground for the Indian Army, if that makes sense.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just go a bit before 1857 as well, because why would what was the appeal of joining the is it the East Indian Company by before 1857?
Yeah,
What is the appeal of joining that rather than the regular army, for example? 'Cause I assume that they were different. They were differently
yeah.
run.
So yeah, they're completely separate entities. So you had to obviously in the British Army up until the 1870s, you had to buy your commission. So
Mm,
again, you needed a certain level of wealth to begin with, whereas the EIC paid higher wages and much lower living costs, as well as the opportunity to take civilian employment, which was quite lucrative once you got out there. So that appealed to the less well-heeled, perhaps,
mhm.
um, and sort of as I sort of touched on, the entrance standards were considerably lower as well.
So it is as if people to get those commissions, especially at the beginning, which is yeah, which is interesting as well to think about. Um, there's so many questions, so I'll take the next one as well. And it's all really about 1857, obviously rebellion. Were there any other? You mentioned there was there was strike as well, with Meacham. But was there any other mutinies in the late 19th century that took place in the Indian Army, or was it generally kept the word, but kept in order in until the First World War?
Yeah, there's one more really significant one, I would say, and that
Mm,
is in 1886 at a hill station on the northwest frontier called Almora.
mm,
The the third who was stationed there? The third Gurkhas were stationed there, and they were commanded by a chap called Harry Leicester, Colonel Harry Leicester, VC. He'd earned his VC in 1857 mutiny actually,
okay.
um, and he was fiddling the books ever so slightly in that he was claiming recompense for very high quality rice. The type
Okay.
which in the commission afterwards suggested that an Indian would only eat at a wedding. It was sort of really high quality stuff. The Gurkhas were actually eating a much lower grade rice, but Leicester was sharing the spoils of this additional allowance amongst his men. So they were essentially all getting a little bit extra in their pay packet. Apart from
Oh.
Leicester then leaves the regiment, he's replaced by Colonel Money, who says there will be no more extra money. So if you're a member of the 3rd Gurkha, suddenly you're getting less pay because there's been a change at the top. And so it's called a mutiny because it is strictly by definition a mutiny, but it's a peaceful one. And effectively, everyone refuses to leave the parade ground. When the district commander is there for a tour, so it's obviously quite embarrassing for Colonel Money. The ringleaders are then interned, and at that point, everybody again refuses to leave the parade ground until their colleagues are released. At which point, the district commander has to take control of the situation, meet with the ringleaders, understand their issues. There are a few other, like the pay or the lowering of the pay is the big one, but there's others such as having to cook outside in the rain and a couple of other bits like that. I can't just remember off the top of my head, but essentially, again, both with Meacham in 65 and that one in 1886, they are peaceful mutinies, but it causes considerable concern because what you find with the Indian Army, even in the First World War and afterwards, is that the spectre of 1857 is always there. And that sort of fear of another mass mutiny.
That the memory, the kind of the just the thinking about it aspect, its legacy had just continued on and affected the army well for next decades and decades afterwards. I mean, as I told you before we started, I did a bit of at university a module on the Indian Mutiny, and how it basically it's also stayed in the idea of Indian independence as well in the 20th century as well. I mean, is that also true? Did it also? I was trying to get the right word, but kind of help and kind of create, I guess, an image to look back to as a kind of like a independence movement, kind of in that period.
That's a tough question. I'm not.
So,
I'm not 100% sure. I think there certainly is elements of that, but I think that 1857, to my understanding, probably feeds into nationalism today more than it did to Indian nationalists trying to overthrow the British sort of 20th century. That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, but which is perfectly perfectly reasonable answer as well, because again, different parts of history are used at different times to make different arguments. So that makes perfect sense. The other thing I was just going to mention as well is that it definitely seems that with the two mutinies that take place afterwards, you mentioned it in as well in the talk. This idea of finance and money that seems to be an underlying factor that I guess the British Army and Indian Army kind of struggle with in this period of trying to figure out how do you actually fund this force? How do you fund it efficiently, correctly, and make it efficient fighting forces? Is that true? Is it quite is a lot of the issues down to money in the end?
Yes, because that is the main reason an Indian peasant joins the army. Most are from an agricultural background, and they join the army to supplement the family's farming, essentially. So they join for the regular pay. And a lot, unless they're on campaign, are allowed to return home for the harvest and things like that as well. So if you're not getting that regular pay you sign on for, everything else is sort of immaterial, I guess, because that supports not only yourself but probably your extended family.
So it's essential to why you're there. It's literally is a big part of the reason why. So once that's impacted, it completely changes your kind of mindset of what you're doing as well, doesn't it? So, which again makes sense. And the last question I have, and that'll be nice because take us just past the hour. So just another one more question. It really links to this kind of I can't remember the person's name, but that person who was it that the army tried the Peel Commission tried to start it afterwards with the irregular with what was his, I can't remember his name now, but the fact that he had such his battalion had so much loyalty towards him.
Oh, John Jacob.
That's it. Sorry, yeah, I got there eventually. I'm terrible with names, even today. I mean, why do you? I guess in some ways, why didn't that take on that idea of staying with your regiment, the idea of being part of the regiment, I guess, because you said a lot of them were focused on the holiday that they got as well, so they could get back. Why was he such a unique case, and was it wrong for the army to look at his kind of regiment as an example? Do you think was that a wrong way to do it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think people like John Jacob, like James Skinner, they are relatively unique in that
Okay.
they what's the term I'm looking for? They embrace sort of their Indian troops, Indian culture, sort of, and they obviously clearly, given that they don't take furlough and leave, etc., sort of eat, sleep, and breathe being with their regiment, which yes makes them a great commander, but it's not unreasonable for other officers to say, "Hang on a minute, I would like my holiday. I'd like to go back to the Norfolk Broads or wherever it is I come from and have a couple of months off."
Hmm.
And yeah, it's a sort of this is what I sort of suggested. It's real trial and error. Trying to effectively run a battalion with sort of substitutes for everybody, so if people can take holidays and things like that, it gets a little bit tangled and a little bit messy, I think.
And how long were the holidays for? How big
Well,
period
you
was
you,
this?
you could apply for as much as 9 months furlough, given that it takes several
Wow.
weeks to get back to Britain.
Mm. Yeah, I was gonna say,
Um,
'cause I said if they go back to England, then it's gonna be quite a big travel, especially in this period as well, to get back to England.
yeah,
Um,
until the Suez Canal opens, you're talking
yeah,
a good old trek back. So yeah, 9 months was sort of fairly standard to get as an officer.
of course that's
Smaller
9 months away from
smaller periods would allow you to travel within India, even sort of as far as China.
Hmm,
But yeah,
hmm.
9 months is the most you would get.
So I mean, again, that's a long time, isn't it? Away from your force, away from you, the men that you're commanding. So of course
Especially
that
if, if,
break.
if
Hmm.
potentially you're in a battalion in a regular battalion where there's only 6 of you to start with.
Yeah, it it completely changes it, doesn't it? The dynamics.
Yeah.
Um, oh, we actually have a question coming through, which I will put from the audience, um, which is: do you think that by 1900 the Indian Army officer was of superior quality to that of the British Army?
Good evening, Chris. Um, y- y- yes and no. If the fighting's on the northwest frontier of India, more than likely. That is where the Indian Army officers, generally speaking, aim to go and serve. It's where they sort of cut their teeth.
Hmm.
Um, but I think if we can sort of cheat slightly and fast forward 14 years, I think the Indian Army officers get shown up when we reach the First World War, because they are very used to these small wars fighting on the northwest frontier. And when we come to a major European war, they aren't what Gary Sheffield sort of calls war managers. And you even get at Gallipoli in 1915 cases of Indian Army officers leading them from the front, sword drawn, only to be mown down by a machine gun. But I think, sort of to go back to Chris's question, I think by 1900, I think the Indian Army officer probably is of superior quality by dint of experience. Uh,
Hmm.
when it comes to small wars, which is what, of course, the Indian and British armies were used to fighting in this point.
Yeah, of course. The obviously 1914 is obviously a very different. Is a whole kind of well, a game changer in a lot of things, isn't it? But I can definitely see what you're saying there. Thank you for the question. I mean, thank you. We appreciate that. But we have probably come past the hour now, 8:05. So we will call it there. Thank you, Chris, for that question, and thank you, especially Adam, though, for a brilliant talk and fascinating talk. Something that I knew very little about, so be able to gauge of it, it's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you
Thank you
for
for
that.
having me.
It's been an absolute privilege. Loved it, absolutely loved it. So thanks so much for that. Thank you everyone for being here. And hopefully we'll see you again for our next talk. But until then, I'll say bye, and we will see you all very, very soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.